Yep.
We're good?
Yeah,
Okay.
Good to see you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, even if I can only be here virtually. I was at, was it called Ruby World back in 2005? I think that was 2005 or 2006. I went to Tokyo for the conference. So I hope to come back and do it in person when we're all done with this pandemic.
The Japanese community will waiting for you to meet in person, physically. But the situation has changed this year, so that But we can talk. We are very glad to talk with you, even online.
My pleasure to be here.
I'd be honored to host you for the Ruby World Conference 2020. So I'm going to give you some Q&A session so that the people in the Japanese community will know about you and your idea and your opinion. So then we ask the community for the questions to give you, and we had so many questions, but the time is limited, so that we choose some of them for this 30-minute session. So the first question is, so that you visited us in the 2006, I think, for the Ruby Kaigi.
Yes.
So that they must be interested in your idea, so that you in person. So that how did you become DHH? I mean, so that how did you learn programming, and then how did you improve yourself and become the creator of the popular web application framework? And you became, the very rich person. So that how did you become you?
Yeah, no, that's a deep question. I think we could talk about for many hours. I'll try to summarize it briefly by saying I was late to programming. I was not someone who programmed from when I was a little kid. I tried to learn, but the programming languages that were available at that time, whether that was BASIC or AMOS or Assembler, they never spoke to me in a way that I could understand. It was not for lack of will or interest. I always loved computers, but I couldn't understand. And I didn't have anyone at the time to help me understand. So it wasn't until I was really in my 20s before I became to think of myself as a programmer. Even though I had been programming for a couple of years in other languages like PHP or Java or ASP.NET, I didn't really think of myself as I'm a programmer until I discovered Ruby. And that sounds perhaps like a fan thing to say, but it's really true that Ruby was the inflection point where I went, okay, I sort of kind of know how to do some things in programming, and I have to do those things because I want to create things for the web. But then after Ruby, I went, oh, I can be a programmer. I can really like programming for its own sake, as an expression of creativity, as just as an endeavor of learning, that's fun in itself. It's not just a tool. Right? I used to think of programming before Ruby as this is a tool. I use it to make the computer do what I want to do. And now, after discovering Ruby, what is that now, 18 years ago? That was the moment where I went like, no, Ruby is more than just a tool. It's a language in its core sense that this allows me to express myself. I can say things in code that I didn't even know I had in me. And I think this is one of the most powerful things about learning a new language, is that it literally opens your mind. Your mind used to be able to see this, and all of a sudden, your mind can see this. And that is such a powerful feeling that the first language probably that really opens your eyes, you have a tendency to fall in love with. And that's what I did with Ruby. I fell in love with Ruby, and I became a programmer as an identity because of Ruby. And that was then also why quickly after adopting Ruby, I started making what I needed to make, which was tools for the web. And at that time, Ruby didn't have a lot of tools for the web, but it wasn't even something I was concerned about. Now, when you hear people look at languages, they look at, oh, does it have this library? Does it have this library? I was like, I don't care. I'll just build it. If I need it, I will build it. And building all those things was what became Rails. Back in from 2003, when I really started working with Ruby to build Basecamp, until early 2004, I built all the stuff I needed to make that happen. It wasn't that hard, which sounds weird because, first of all, I wasn't that great of a programmer. I had only just started thinking of myself as a programmer. I had only just learned Ruby, and I needed something to build for the web. Today, when you look at something like Ruby on Rails, which is, I don't know, 50,000 lines, 100,000 lines of code, is this huge framework. People think, oh, that must have been so hard. But it didn't start like that. In fact, when I announced Rails on the Ruby Talk mailing list in, I think 2003, I started talking about it. I said it was 1,000 lines of code. Most programmers can write 1,000 lines of code. It's not that hard. But for me, it was just this pivotal moment. I didn't know what I couldn't do. And Ruby had just opened my eyes. So I went, I'm going to go for it. And not only am I going to go for it, I'm going to share, because I felt such a debt of gratitude, not just to Ruby, although mostly to Ruby, but also to the entire open source community. That everything that I was building, I could only have built because of open source. The Apache web server, the MySQL database, Linux, all of these tools were what was enabling me to express myself. And ultimately, I think that was the formative experience. That's why I'm still a programmer. That's why I'm still in love with Ruby. 18 years later, it's why I still love to be a programmer, even though I run a company of quite a few people and plenty of others in that position, like, oh, I don't program anymore. Like, I don't know, go to meetings or write emails or something like that. And like, programming is my favorite thing. I want to make sure that I continue to do that. So, yeah, I think that's part of the story of
Yes.
becoming me.
Yeah, I'm so honored you still love Ruby and programming. Okay, thank you. The second question is, how do you evaluate yourself and the Ruby on Rails framework, especially achievement in the programming and OS field?
That's a great question. How to evaluate yourself. I think a lot of people evaluate themselves and the things they make by the reception that those creations receive. I've never been a big fan of that. I don't, and it sounds perhaps as in the early days, a little bit arrogant, but I don't really care. I write Ruby, I create Rails, I create other tools that I need because they make me happy, right? Like, I am the audience number one for the things that I write. And I know that sounds selfish, but it's the only way I can really tap into the passion, the creativity, the motivation to continue to do it. Because in large part, I'm doing it first for myself. And then secondly, I mean, it's wonderful that there's so many people who've responded to it. For example, with Rails, lots of people have responded to Rails, but I've created a lot of things over the years that have not had that response. For example, on the client side with JavaScript, I've long not been a big fan of how people use JavaScript to write web applications. So I went in a completely different directions with something called turbolinks. And for a very long time, not only did they not care about turbolinks in a sense that like they don't even know it exists, they didn't like it. And for some people that would feel like, oh no, they don't like the thing I make. I was like, I don't care. I think this is wonderful. I think this is so much better. It's making me happier. It's making me more productive. So my evaluation is really intrinsic and it's internal from my own sense of what is good and what's bad. And that doesn't mean that I think everything I make is good. Not at all. I'm a fierce self-critic about the things that I make. But if I think something is good, that makes me happy. I don't need someone else to also tell me it's good for me to think that that it's worthwhile doing. And conversely, I've had other experiences where I've created something or written something that I didn't think was very good. And then someone told me, oh, I think it's really good. I think it's great. And I was like, doesn't make me feel better. Unless I personally think that this is good, this is high quality, this is the best I can do, there's not a deep sense of satisfaction.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Well, of self-evaluation. Okay, the next question is, okay, as a related question, is there anything you don't like about Ruby on Rails, or if you are able to recreate the framework from the scratch back in 2003, so how do you design? How do you do it differently?
It's a good question, and it's one I've gotten a lot of times, and I'm always trying to rack my brain to come up with a good answer. And the answer to many extents is no. I think on the whole, Ruby on Rails is the best version of what I could arrive with, because the thing is, if I didn't like something about Ruby on Rails, I would just change it. That's part of the wonders of Ruby for me, for example, that the core language allows someone else to come up with their own dialect that makes the language better for them. Mm-hmm. That's what I've done for 18 years with active support, where I've extended the Ruby core language and the core classes and object and number and all these other things in these ways that made the language feel more like it was my language, even though I don't even know how to program C. I don't know how to work on the internals of Ruby. I didn't have to, because Ruby allows a programmer, not only allows, trusts the programmer to extend the language in a way that is on par, that is equal to what the language ships with in its first iteration. So that means if there's something you don't like, or if there's something it's missing, you can just add it. There are very few things where you really hit a wall and say like, oh, I can't do that. And the same thing with Rails in many ways. Rails is obviously just built on top of Ruby. So for the people who there's something they don't like about Rails, there's something they want to change, they can just open it up. And that's the other part of it I found so appealing about working with Ruby and working with Rails, is that when we create a framework, in other languages, the barrier is quite high. Mm-hmm. Even if you know Java, for example, maybe you're not going to go in and figure out how Spring works because it's very detailed, it's very hard. Ruby is such an approachable language that the bar is so much lower that someone can say, I don't really like how this works in Rails, or I don't understand how it works. Boom, I just open up the file, bundle, open, active support. And I can see, oh, how do they do that thing about 5.days? How is that actually implemented? And you can just read it and you can see it. So it means that what we have is not like a beautiful sculpture made in marble. Mm-hmm. It's made in clay. And if we want it to be different, we can just shape it different. And I think that's why I'm still here, right? Like if I was stuck with just the ideas that I had in 2003, 2004, because then I couldn't change them and we had set it in stone, I don't think it would be interesting to still work on Ruby, and it wouldn't be interesting to still work on Rails. It's interesting because almost every day we have the opportunity to change everything. If we get a better idea, we can change it. And that is just such an empowering and addictive feeling that every single time you improve and you get better ideas, we can just put them into the framework. And the next version, it can have some deprecations and it can have some new features. And that's what we've, done over 18 years. If you look at the whole history, we've kept adding things, we've kept removing things, we've changed things. That dynamic relationship with your tools is just invigorating.
Yeah. I remember the Rails, when I first see the active support, so that you are very, I feel you are very brave to extend the language that much. So that, yeah, I was pretty impressed. It was me allow that kind of things, but very few people try that. Yeah.
I think it's such an important point, and I keep bringing it up whenever someone asks me, why is it you like Ruby so much? It's both the technical, I love the design of it, but it's really more fundamental. It's the trust. To me, it's very much like, at least my idea of parenthood, right? You have a child, you see them grow, you see them learn, and you think, you know better for everything. And you could just say, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that. But sometimes you could also just allow them to perhaps make what you think is a mistake, but maybe it's not a mistake, right? Like that amount of trust really develops a deep bond between a programming language and a person, or between people. And I think that trust is very unique. And at the time when I first came to Ruby, I had been working at a Java shop, and Java is the extreme opposite. There's no trust. The language is designed in such a way that you don't have to trust the people who work with it, because they can't do anything too dangerous or too dumb. Where Ruby went the other way and said, you can do some dangerous things, you can extend the base classes, and people have ever since, they thought like, oh, this is going to lead to calamity. People are going to blow it up, they're going to extend it in ways that are not compatible, and all the software is just going to fail. And it didn't happen, because I think fundamentally, people are trustworthy humans. Mm-hmm. Trust is a very hard thing to give, but you get back, right? That's part of it. As the same thing with a child or with a relation with another person. When you extend your trust, someone is very likely to return that favor with like, oh, you trust me, then I will do the right thing.
Yeah, that's great things here. Okay, thank you. So the next question is, how will Rails change in the future? And when will be the Rails 7 release? And what kind of change will be in that release?
Yes, so there's a bunch of ideas that I've had for a very long time. I keep hoping we will realize. One of those ideas is to move more of the tooling around Rails into the web. When I first started with PHP and building my own little frameworks that I never released, the whole management, like how to control scaffolding, how to run migrations, that was all done in a web interface. And I love the command line, but it's not a very nice interface for most things. You have to remember a lot of arcane commands, or you have to type help all the time. It would be much nicer if we had a graphical interface. And it feels a little frustrating at times to feel like I've had these ideas for 20 years, and somehow I've never managed to really get them into Rails. So I hope that's going to happen. But otherwise, I'd say one of the big movements that we have with Rails right now is the integration with the front end. I think actually, if you look at the back end right now, it's quite good. You look at things like Active Record, for example, and we're extending it. GitHub in particular has done a lot of wonderful work to make Active Record work better with sharding and multiple databases and scaling, essentially make Active Record work for an enormous company like GitHub. That's great. But we're kind of polishing the edges. It's really good. It's really solid. I don't have any breakthrough ideas for Active Record, for example, that's really going to change things. But where I do have some ideas for where to really change things is how Rails integrates with the front end. Because a lot of people have, for a variety of reasons, adopted like single page applications. They use React or Redux or Vue or something. And there's some good ideas there, but I think it is the area of web development that is most ripe for improvement. When you look at the amount of work that goes in on the front end right now, it reminds me of all the dark days of J2E, of the Java Enterprise Edition that was very complicated. You had local beans and remote beans, and it was a mess to set up. And now you look at the front end and you're like, it looks kind of similar. It's a mess to set up. It's a mess to maintain. And what are we really getting out of all that complexity? A few better UX models, sort of, kind of. So what I've been working on for the past year, maybe even 2 years, as we've been developing Hey, our new email service from Basecamp, is a whole new approach, not whole new approach, but a extended approach to what the ideas that we had with Turbolinks, the ideas that we had with Stimulus, and then taking them to the next level. I've been meaning to reveal all this work we've been doing for a long time, and then push that together with Rails in a way that feels even simpler. Right now, what Rails ships with is it has its own asset pipeline, which is sort of the classic form we have for compiling style sheets and JavaScript. And then we found out it's not good enough for JavaScript anymore. JavaScript actually has their own compilers now, and they're very good, and we should use those instead. So we added Webpack. And that's good, but it's a little creaky, right? The integration is a little, it's like there's a little bit of sand in there, and it's not really smooth. So I'd like to make that smoother, in part by reducing the reliance that most applications need to have on very sophisticated, advanced JavaScript. In fact, and the funny thing is, I no longer hate JavaScript. I used to really not like JavaScript. In 2006 to 2008, I didn't like JavaScript at all. We tried all sorts of ways of having Ruby generate JavaScript because we didn't want to write JavaScript. But now, with modern JavaScript, ES6 and so on, it's a pretty okay language. It's not a great language, but it's so much better. So it's not that like I don't like it. There are some people working on projects that still translate from Ruby to JavaScript, and I don't see the point. I think there's too much of a mismatch. I don't think the benefits are large enough. So it's not that JavaScript is like a terrible language. In fact, it's decent. It's okay. And I write actually a fair amount of JavaScript, and I don't hate it. I don't love it. I don't hate it. I'm just kind of in the middle.
Yes, right.
But I would like to write less, because I feel like all this stuff we're writing and all this stuff we're adding, it's not adding enough value. That there are some of these conceptual compressions. I spoke about this at RailsConf a few years back, where Active Record, we just spoke about Active Record. Most people can build an entire application today. They don't even write any SQL code. They don't have any complete SQL statements anywhere in the source code. We used to do that all the time. Active Record got really good. Now you need to do it very rarely. We can do much of the same, in my opinion, with JavaScript. That most developers, most of the times, won't need to write JavaScript if we come up with some better abstractions and conceptual compressions for the front end. So part of that is that these two things go together. And this is what makes Rails special, I think. That when Rails first came out, there was Django, and there were other frameworks that all tried to be the whole thing. And now people have lost interest in that. There's not a lot of people working on an integrated system. Everyone is working on, I have this little framework here, and if you put together that with that framework and that framework, if you put 15 frameworks together, you can get something that sort of kind of works. No, let's make one system that's really good to create the entire application. That is what motivates me, and it requires us to work on both sides. We have to work with JavaScript. We have to work with the front end, and we have to work with the back end, and we have to put those things together so that they work very well. And that continues to be the inspiration. That's where my focus is now.
Okay. Okay. I have many questions regarding the JavaScript, but you have explained already. So that the future relationship will be the less JavaScript
I hope
in a way. Yeah. The one idea is having the web API and separated the front end in JavaScript or the apps and the mobile apps, for example. But you are not going to take that approach.
No, in fact, I'm going to take exactly the opposite approach. And that is the cornerstone of these new ideas we're putting out, that instead of separating things and building this distributed system, I don't like distributed systems. I think the first law of distributed systems is do not distribute your systems. If you can ever avoid it, there's so much complexity once you change a method call to a network call. Inherently, there's nothing we can do about the fact that two machines talking to each other is so much more complicated. All the failure states are complicated. All the orchestration is complicated compared to just method calls. So I prefer to make as many method calls as possible, preferably in Ruby, and then we send a finished application to the client side. So that's what we're doubling down on. This approach puts HTML at the center of everything, not JSON. So it's not about having an API server that sends JSON, and then you have another application that's in JavaScript that takes that JSON and turns it into a bunch of HTML. No, no, no. The backend produces HTML, and the client renders that HTML, uses some frameworks to make that HTML more interactive and more fast, but that's it. Because the wonderful thing is, once you get to render your HTML on the server side, you get to write Ruby. You get to write your entire UI in Ruby, all ERB, helper methods, interact with your domain model is so much easier when it's happening at the same point as your domain model. Because the problem is when you use JSON to communicate back and forth, you have to implement the person object or the shop object or the post object on both sides. Now you're doing twice the work, right? This is one of the reasons why in the JavaScript land they're so excited about isomorphism, right? That you write JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the back end, because then there's a little bit less of that mismatch. We have an entirely different idea that arrives at the same point, that you only write things once. It's just that you write them on the server and then you send HTML to the client, and then you use frameworks like TurboLinks and the stuff we're developing to make it just as good and just as fast as single page applications.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of eye-opening for me. So thank you. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Okay. The next question is, are you interested in self-made keyboards? It's kind of popular in Japan. So that, building your keyboard by yourself.
Oh, the funny thing is, no. I like the sound. I like the nostalgia, but it's not my big hobby. In fact, my favorite keyboard, even though it's no longer really my favorite company, is the boring Apple Air keyboard, the separate keyboard too. It has small travel. It doesn't actually make a lot of sound. But I love the creativity of it because it reminds me of how we used to have fun with hardware, right? I would build my own PC. I would build my own computers back in the day. Now we just buy everything, and it's all very nice and it's all very pretty and it works, but it's not fun, right? Like there's nothing fun about buying a new MacBook. There's something very fun about building your own keyboard and having it light up or having it just make crazy rackety sounds. I think that's really needed. I think programmers often have this weird relationship with fun. They think fun sometimes don't mean serious, or that it doesn't mean professional. That if you're professional, you're supposed to be serious. You're not supposed to have fun. Everything is just supposed to work. No, we're supposed to have fun. That's why I think you look at some of the things, both in Ruby and in Rails, they don't make sense in sort of an objective notion. They're just fun. We just made it like that because it's fun, and that is a value in itself that we should cherish and embrace. So I'm a little envious, actually. I wish this was something I liked because I would like to have more fun with my computer, the hardware again.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very bad at soldering, but my friends try to build up some kind of very small one or like the separate one. That should be very fun. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The last question is not the last question. Okay, it's about time. It's the last question. What do you like about Bats Me? It's from the new guru.
Sir, can you repeat? I didn't hear it.
What do you like about me, myself, the creator of the language? That's a silly question.
Yes, so I think we talked about this a little bit, but I think actually many of the things we've talked about are things you put out into the world. The fact that you build a language that trusts the programmer to an extent that I have not seen any other language do, neither before nor after, in the way that at least that I've worked with it. That's truly unique, and it opened my eyes in a way that was the reason why I fell in love with the language, because I didn't even know that was possible. I didn't even know that it was possible that someone else could trust a stranger that much with their language. Like, this is something they created, and they say, here's a gift to you. You can help me create it too. And that forms a really unique bond, I think. And then the other thing was this idea that who are we making the programming language for? Is it for the computer? Is it just that the computer is more effective? No, it's for the programmer. And that switch, the way that you positioned Ruby as the programmer's friend, as to help the programmer, not to help the computer. I mean, we also try to help the computer, but if we have to choose, we rather help the programmer. We rather help the human, and then we do the work that's annoying to make that work for the computer. Was a really just eye-opening experience for me that also just I had not looked at programming like that. I hadn't even thought about it in that way. And I can tie that directly back to why programming did not appeal to me. And I think this is why I'm so passionate about Ruby, because the language you created turned something that I was fascinated by, but I didn't quite understood, to something I really got. It really spoke to me in a language that no one else was speaking like that. And I think that this is part of why Ruby went from being such a small thing to such a big thing in so quickly, because so many people were ready to hear that. There were so many people who didn't identify themselves as these serious engineers who just cared about like performance and making things structurally sound and whatever. They wanted to have fun. They wanted to be trusted. They wanted to hear that the programming language was for them. And I think that's just remains unique. That's the other thing. You would think that Ruby has been around for so long that most other programming languages or environment, they would have taken all the best ideas, but they don't, because those ideas remain controversial. Not every programmer think that programming should be fun. Lots of them actually think the opposite. So this is why Ruby remains unique. I also think it's why Rails remains unique to many extents, because all the things that makes Ruby Ruby and Rails Rails remain controversial ideas that not everyone will get behind. And those are the ideas I love. Like, to me, it's almost boring to release something that everyone just loves in all the same ways, because it usually means it's bland, right? Like, oh, we love blue oceans and sunny skies. Okay, that's not very interesting. You're not saying very much. Ruby had an opinion that was cutting, it was deep, it was human in a way that that humanity had not been represented before. And I think she's deeply inspiring. So I want to thank you very much for creating the language that gave me a career, that helped me form who I am, that to this day, 18 years later, is one of my favorite things to do in the whole world.
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored that this is a treasure moment for me. Okay, thank you for having time with us. And yeah, this is wonderful interview, and wonderful. We are very glad to hear your great opinions and ideas. I wish this situation has end, and we would have the chance to meet in person someday.
Absolutely, I will come back to Japan as soon as I can. Loved it there, and hopefully next year we can do it again in person.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.